The moon feast at Briarwood Palace was the kind of night that made the old stories feel true. Silver banners hung from the high stone arches, catching the candlelight and throwing soft, shifting patterns across the floor. Chandeliers made of pale crystal hung above long tables set with silver plates, and wolves were carved into every pillar in the hall, frozen mid-stride, watching the room the way they had watched it for 300 years. Musicians played near the far wall, a slow melody meant to calm the room rather than excite it, and nobles in velvet and fur moved between tables with cups of spiced wine, laughing at things that did not need to be funny. Clara Remington stood near the center of that hall, and she had never felt so alone in a crowded room. She wore no jewels that night, except the silver bracelet on her wrist, the one Ellis had given her on the morning he swore she would be his only queen. She remembered his exact words from that day, the way he had held both her hands and told her the bracelet was a promise written in metal, something that could not be argued with the way words could be argued with. She had believed him completely. She had not imagined, standing in the sunlight of that morning years ago, that a promise made in metal could still be broken by silence. Tonight, his promise meant nothing. Lady Evangeline Briarwood rose from her seat at the head table, and the hall quieted the way it always did when she stood. She had a way of commanding a room without raising her voice, a stillness that made people lean in rather than look away. Beside her, a young woman named Noelle Winslow rose too, dressed in pale silk that caught the candlelight, one hand resting gently over her stomach. Noelle kept her eyes low, the picture of a woman who wanted no trouble, no attention, nothing but peace and protection. The court had already decided what that posture meant. Tonight, Evangeline said, her voice carrying easily across the stone floor without effort, Briarwood has hope again. A murmur rolled through the nobles like wind through tall grass. Some smiled openly, some glanced toward Clara, with expressions that ranged from pity to something closer to satisfaction, the quiet pleasure people feel when a story they suspected is finally confirmed. A few looked away entirely, because they understood exactly what was happening in front of them, and did not have the courage to say a single word against it. Clara looked toward the throne, where Ellis sat with his hands folded in his lap, his expression carefully arranged into something neutral. She willed him to look at her, to say something, to do anything at all that proved the years they had spent together still meant something inside this room. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor in front of him, as if the pattern of the marble had suddenly become the most important thing in Briarwood. That was the moment Clara understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in how complete it was, that the betrayal would not come from Noelle, or even from Evangeline. It would come from the silence of the man she had given up everything to marry. Evangeline continued, unhurried, enjoying the attention of the room. She said the pack had waited long enough for an heir. She said the bloodline needed protecting, and that protecting it sometimes meant difficult decisions had to be made for the good of everyone. She said Noelle would remain in the palace, sheltered and cared for, until her child was safely born. Noelle lowered her eyes further and said, in a voice soft enough that the whole hall leaned forward to catch it, that she never wanted to come between a husband and his wife. She said she only wanted to help the pack survive, that she had not asked for any of this attention, that she only wished for quiet and safety during a difficult time. Clara knew the truth behind every gentle word Noelle offered. She had carried a secret for years, one that belonged to Ellis and not to her, and she had carried it because she loved him enough to take the blame the court placed on her shoulders, instead of letting them see who he truly was beneath his crown. That loyalty, that years of silent protection, had bought her nothing in this hall tonight. Ellis finally spoke. He did not stand. He did not look at her directly. He said only, "This is for the future of the pack." 6 words. They landed harder than anything Evangeline or Noelle had said all night, because they came from him, the one person in the room who was supposed to stand between Clara and exactly this kind of cruelty. Clara reached up and unclasped the silver bracelet from her wrist. Her fingers did not shake. The hall fell silent as it slipped free and struck the marble floor, the small sound somehow louder than the music that had been playing only moments before. louder than the murmuring of the nobles, louder than her own heartbeat in her ears. She looked at Ellis one last time, searching his face for something, anything, that might still make this bearable. She found nothing. "I left an alpha bloodline for you," she said, her voice steady and clear enough to reach every corner of the hall. "Tonight, I return to claim it." She turned and walked toward the doors of the throne hall, while laughter rippled behind her, soft and cruel. Nobles already certain they had just watched a broken woman walk away in shame, already composing the version of this story they would tell at breakfast tomorrow. None of them understood what they had actually witnessed. They had just watched the rightful heiress of the Remington pack leave Briarwood Palace for the last time. Behind her, the hall slowly began to stir again, voices rising back into their usual chatter, though some of the older nobles exchanged glances that carried more uncertainty than amusement. There were a few among them who remembered the Remington name from before Clara's marriage, who remembered hearing it spoken with the same caution reserved for old storms, the kind that pass quietly for years, and then return all at once without warning. Evangeline lowered herself back into her seat, satisfied, believing the matter fully settled. Noelle reached for Ellis's hand beneath the table, and he allowed it, though his eyes stayed fixed on the doors Clara had walked through, on the bracelet still lying where it had fallen, catching the candlelight from the floor. No servant moved to pick it up that night. It would still be there in the morning, untouched, a small silver circle resting against the cold marble. The first sign that something in Briarwood had shifted in a way no announcement could undo. Hours before the feast, in the quiet hours of the late afternoon, Clara had been arranging moon lilies in a glass vase on the table of her private chambers, trying to make a palace that never quite felt like home feel a little more like one. The flowers had come from the eastern garden, the only part of Briarwood she had truly come to love, and she had cut them herself that morning, walking the stone paths alone, while the rest of the palace still slept. She did not dress like a woman born into power. She wore simple gray, her hair loose around her shoulders, because she had chosen love over status years ago, and had never once regretted the choice out loud, even when the cost grew heavier with each passing season. There had been a time when she wore the deep blue of the Remington colors with pride, when servants bowed without being asked, when her name alone opened doors across the northern kingdom. She had set all of that aside, piece by piece, the way someone sets down a heavy coat in a warm room, certain they would not need it again. She had left the Remington pack to be here. She had walked away from her mother's throne, away from a bloodline that stretched back further than Briarwood's own history, because Ellis had looked at her the way no one else ever had, like she was the only person in any room he had ever truly seen. That look had felt like more than any inheritance. It had felt like being chosen, finally, for herself, and not for what she could bring to a pack. She remembered the day she told her mother of her decision, standing in the same great hall where she had been crowned heir as a child. Rosalind had not shouted. She had simply asked Clara to sit, and had listened to every reason Clara offered, without interrupting once. When Clara finished, Rosalind had said only that love built on equal ground could withstand almost anything. But love built where one person gave everything, and the other gave only what was convenient, would eventually wear thin, no matter how strong it felt at the start. Clara had not understood the warning then. She had been too certain of what she and Ellis shared to imagine it could ever apply to her. She had accepted the whispers that followed her into Briarwood. The nobles believed an Alpha King's wife should give the pack an heir within the first year of marriage, and when no child came, they assumed the failure belonged to her. She let them assume it. She let them speak behind silk fans and behind closed doors, because the alternative was telling them the truth, and the truth was not hers to tell. It belonged to Ellis, and she had promised to guard it the way she guarded everything she loved, quietly and completely. Ellis had asked her for that silence on a night she still remembered with painful clarity. He had held her hands the way he always did when he needed something from her, his grip a little too tight, his eyes a little too wide, and he had asked her never to let the council know what she knew about him. She had agreed because she loved him, and because love, she believed then, meant protecting the people you chose. even when protecting them cost you something of your own. The door to her chamber opened without a knock. Lady Evangeline entered first, moving with the certainty of a woman who had never once doubted her right to walk into any room she pleased, in this palace or anywhere else. Noelle Winslow followed a step behind her, soft-footed, eyes downcast in a way that looked humble and felt, to Clara, carefully practiced, like a performance rehearsed in front of a mirror. "This room smells of lilies," Noelle said quietly, almost to herself, though she clearly meant for Clara to hear. "I have always found strong scents difficult during pregnancy." Clara set down the flower in her hand, taking a slow breath before answering. "I can open a window if you would like." "It is not the flowers," Evangeline said, stepping further into the room, as though she were inspecting it for purchase. "It is the room itself. Noelle needs rest, and the sunlit master chamber would suit her far better than the small guest quarters she has been given. The light there is gentler in the mornings." Clara understood immediately what was being asked of her, though the request was wrapped in concern for someone else's comfort. "That chamber belongs to Ellis and me." Evangeline's expression did not change, but something in her voice sharpened, the way a blade sharpens with a single careful pass. A woman who cannot protect the bloodline should not speak so proudly of what belongs to her. The words struck exactly where they were meant to strike. Clara kept her face calm, though something inside her chest folded inward, quiet and familiar, the way it always did when Evangeline spoke to her this way. She had grown almost used to absorbing these moments without flinching, though the practice had never made them hurt less. Ellis arrived a moment later, drawn by the raised voices, though his presence did little to settle the room the way Clara hoped it would. She turned to him, certain that now, in their own home, surrounded by people who had no business standing in this chamber, he would finally say what she needed him to say. "Noelle will only stay for a while," Ellis said instead, his eyes flicking briefly to his mother, before settling somewhere near Clara's shoulder, never quite meeting her gaze. "Try to understand." Clara studied his face, searching for some sign that this cost him anything at all, any flicker of guilt or hesitation. She found very little, and the absence of it told her more than any words could have. That night, after the others had gone, and the palace had settled into its evening quiet, Clara passed by the open door of the guest chamber, and saw Noelle standing before the jewelry case that held the Luna stones, the ones passed down through generations of Briarwood wives, each piece older than the kingdom itself. Noelle's fingers moved gently over the silver settings, lifting one piece and turning it slowly in the candlelight. She noticed Clara in the doorway, and smiled, unbothered, as though there were nothing at all unusual about a guest handling jewelry that belonged to the lady of the house. Lady Evangeline said, "I may need these soon." Clara said nothing. She did not need to. She understood now, watching Noelle's hands move so easily over jewelry that had never once been offered to her this freely, that this was not shelter being offered to a frightened young woman. This was a slow, careful replacement, arranged by people who had decided Clara's place in this palace could simply be handed to someone else, like a chair pulled out from under her, while everyone pretended not to notice. She walked to the feast that night, already knowing, somewhere beneath her calm exterior, that something irreversible was coming, something the candlelight and the music could not soften. Before she left her chamber, she stopped in front of the small mirror near the door and studied her own reflection for a long moment, the way a person studies a stranger they are trying to recognize. She remembered standing in front of that same mirror on her wedding day, younger, certain that the life waiting for her on the other side of the door would be softer than the one she had left behind in Remington. She had believed, then, that love alone could carry the weight of a kingdom's expectations. She thought of her mother's voice from years earlier, the warning she had dismissed so easily at the time. Rosalind had not forbidden the marriage outright. She had simply asked Clara one question before giving her blessing. What will you do the day his loyalty to you costs him something he is not willing to pay? Clara had not had an answer then. She suspected, walking toward the feast hall now, that she finally did. A maid passed her in the corridor, eyes lowered, and offered no greeting at all, hurrying on toward the kitchens without a backward glance. Clara did not call after her. She understood now that even the smallest kindnesses in this palace had quietly become conditional, measured out according to whoever held more favor that week. In the days that followed the feast, the palace began to shift in small, quiet ways that added up to something much larger than any single moment could explain. The kitchen staff began serving Noelle first at every meal. Her trays carried on gold rather than silver, a detail no one explained but everyone understood without being told. Fresh flowers appeared in her chamber each morning, the same kind Clara had always kept in her own room, cut from the same garden by the same hands. Evangeline began referring to Noelle, in front of guests and staff alike, as the future of Briarwood, the words spoken with a warmth she had never once offered Clara, not even in their best years. Clara found herself growing invisible inside the home she had once tried so hard to make feel like her own. Servants who used to greet her by name now offered only brief nods before hurrying past, their eyes carrying a kind of pity she found harder to bear than open cruelty would have been. Noelle was careful about when she revealed her true self. In front of Ellis, she remained soft-spoken and grateful, thanking him for his kindness, praising the pack's strength, never once raising her voice or asking for anything directly. Alone with Clara, her tone changed completely, the gentleness folding away like a costume removed once the audience had left. Men like Ellis need a legacy more than they need love, Noelle told her one afternoon, walking slowly through the garden, with one hand resting on her stomach, her steps unhurried, her voice almost kind in its delivery. The pack will always choose the woman who can give them an heir, no matter how much they once loved someone else. Clara kept her composure, though each word landed like a small, precise blow she had not braced for in time. Is that meant to comfort me, or warn me? Neither, Noelle said, plucking a single flower from a nearby bush and turning it between her fingers. It is simply true. You will understand that eventually, I think. Most women do. Clara left her in the garden and walked the long way back toward the palace, past the old training yard where she had once watched Ellis spar with his guards in the early years of their marriage, laughing easily, calling out to her from across the field whenever he caught her watching. She tried to remember the last time he had laughed like that in front of her, and found she could not place it with any certainty. The memory had blurred somewhere along the way, replaced gradually by quieter rooms and careful silences. Inside the palace, she passed two of the older household staff speaking in low voices near the kitchen entrance. They stopped when they noticed her, offering quick bows, but not before she caught the tail end of their conversation. Something about how the household budget had quietly shifted toward Noelle's chamber over the past month. New linens, new furniture, expenses that had never once been questioned by the steward overseeing the accounts. Clara said nothing about it. She simply filed the detail away, the way she had learned to file away every small sign that the ground beneath her was shifting. That evening, before the council confrontation in the hall, Clara sat alone for a while in the small library off the east wing, a room she had once spent many quiet afternoons in during her first year of marriage, reading by the window while Ellis attended to council matters elsewhere in the palace. She ran her fingers along the spines of the books, many of them gifts she had brought with her from Remington, small pieces of her old life tucked quietly into a place that had never fully become her own. She wondered, sitting there in the fading afternoon light, how much longer she would have stayed silent had the feast never happened, had Evangeline never pushed quite so far in front of so many witnesses. The thought unsettled her more than she expected, the idea that perhaps some part of her might have continued absorbing smaller cruelties indefinitely, simply because leaving had always felt like the harder choice. That evening, Ellis came to find Clara in their chamber, the one Evangeline had not yet succeeded in taking from her completely. He sat beside her on the edge of the bed and took her hand, his voice low and earnest, in a way that almost convinced her, even now, that something of what they once had still remained. "I still love you," he said. "Noelle means nothing to me. This is only for the pack." Clara looked down at their joined hands, remembering how those same words had once been enough to make her feel safe, enough to make every sacrifice feel worth its cost. "If I am still your Luna," she asked quietly, "why does she sleep 2 doors from this room, wearing flowers meant for me?" Ellis had no answer. He looked away, the same way he had looked away in the throne hall during the feast, and Clara understood, with a kind of tired clarity, that this had become a pattern she could set her heart by, a rhythm as predictable as the changing of seasons. Alone afterward, sitting by the window as the candle burned low, she allowed herself to remember the night that had started all of this years before. She had discovered a weakness in Ellis then, something that could have shattered his standing before the Alpha Council entirely, if it ever became known among the other packs. He had begged her, frightened in a way she had never seen him before or since, to keep it between them, just the two of them, no one else. She had promised. She had kept that promise, even as the court whispered cruel things about her, even as she let herself be blamed for a failure that was never hers to carry, because she had believed, then, that this was what marriage required of a person who loved deeply enough. She had not understood, in those early years, that her silence would one day become the very tool used against her, sharpened by the hands she had protected. She thought sometimes, in the quiet hours before sleep, about the version of herself that might have existed had she stayed at Remington, had she never agreed to carry a burden that was never hers to begin with. That version of herself, she suspected, would have grown into someone harder, perhaps, but also someone who never had to learn what it felt like to disappear slowly inside her own marriage. She did not regret loving Ellis. She had simply begun, somewhere in the last year, to regret how much of herself she had been willing to trade for that love, piece by piece, until there was barely enough left behind to recognize in the mirror each morning. The next evening, Evangeline summoned her to the main hall, in front of several visiting nobles from a neighboring territory. Noelle stood nearby, eyes wide and frightened, claiming that Clara had spoken to her harshly that morning, had frightened her badly, had threatened the safety of her unborn child with cruel words meant to wound. It was not true. Clara had said nothing of the kind to her that morning, had barely spoken to her at all. But the accusation did not need to be true, to be useful to the people who wanted to use it. "Kneel," Evangeline said, her voice carrying the full weight of her position, "and apologize to her, in front of everyone gathered here." Clara looked toward Ellis, certain that this, finally, in front of guests from another territory, was the moment he would intervene on her behalf. He looked at the floor instead, his jaw tight, his hands clasped behind his back. Clara did not kneel. The visiting nobles shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure where to direct their attention. One older woman, the wife of a neighboring alpha, watched Clara closely, something thoughtful crossing her face rather than judgment. She said nothing in the moment, but later that evening, as the guests prepared to depart, she found a quiet moment to speak with Clara, alone in the corridor outside the hall. "You remind me of someone," the woman said, studying Clara's face. "A young heiress I met once, many years ago, at a gathering in the north. Strong-willed, carried herself like she already knew her own worth, even when others around her did not." Clara managed a small, tired smile. "I am not sure that woman still exists." "She does," the visitor said simply, before turning to follow her husband toward their waiting carriage. "She is only resting." Women like that do not disappear. They wait. Clara stood alone in the corridor long after the carriage wheels had faded into the night, turning the stranger's words over in her mind, uncertain yet whether to believe them, though something in her chest had quietly stirred at hearing them spoken aloud. That night, after the hall had emptied and the candles had burned low into pools of wax, Clara confronted Ellis in their private chamber, her voice quiet but steady, in a way that surprised even her. "How long have you known Noelle would stand beside you like this?" she asked. Ellis sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his shoulders bowed in a way that made him look smaller than she had ever seen him. Smaller than the Alpha King who had once stood tall before the entire council without flinching. "I had no choice. My mother demanded an heir. The council was losing patience with me. The pack needed something to believe in, something solid. And the child," Clara said carefully, watching his face closely for any flicker of truth or hesitation. Is it yours? He hesitated, a pause that lasted no longer than a breath, but felt, to Clara, like an entire season passing. That hesitation told her everything words could not have explained. I allowed it, he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, because I was afraid of losing the throne. Noelle agreed to help secure the Briarwood name, regardless of what was true. You will always be my real Luna, Clara, in my heart, if nowhere else in this palace. Something inside Clara, something that had bent under years of quiet weight without breaking, finally refused to bend any further. She felt it settle, hard and final, somewhere beneath her ribs. I was the one who protected you, she said, her voice steady, despite everything she felt rising inside her chest. I accepted shame from this entire court for years, because you asked me to carry it. I stayed silent, so the council would never learn the truth about you. And this, after everything, is how you repay that silence. Ellis straightened, defensive now rather than apologetic, his expression hardening in a way she had rarely seen directed at her. You should understand the burden I carry as Alpha King. That single sentence revealed him completely, more honestly than anything he had said all night. He did not regret what he had done to her. He regretted only that she had finally found the courage to confront him about it, to name it out loud where it could no longer be quietly ignored between them. Do you remember what you told me, the night you asked for my silence? Clara asked, her voice quiet but unwavering. You said that if the council ever learned the truth, it would not just end your reign, it would end you, in every way that mattered. I believed you. I built years of my life around protecting that fear for you. Ellis did not answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its earlier defensiveness. I remember. Then you understand what it cost me to watch you let another woman take my place, while I was still carrying the very secret that protects your throne to this day, Clara said. You understand exactly what that means, even if you have spent months pretending you do not. He lowered his head, and for one brief moment, something like the man she had once loved seemed to surface beneath the weight of everything he had become. I did not think you would ever truly leave. I thought you loved me too much to walk away, no matter what I asked of you. That, Clara said softly, was always your mistake. You confused my loyalty for something that would never run out, no matter how carelessly you spent it. Ellis sat in silence for a long moment, his hands resting loosely in his lap, before speaking again, his voice quieter than before. What would you have me do? The damage is already done. Noelle is already settled here. My mother has already announced it to the court. That is not my burden to solve, Clara said. It was never my burden to begin with. You built this, piece by piece, decision by decision, while I stood beside you, carrying weight that belonged only to you. I am done carrying it. He reached for her hand, the old instinct still strong despite everything, but she stepped back before he could close the distance. I loved you enough to disappear a little more each year, she said. I will not disappear any further. Clara rose and walked to the small table near the window, beginning to remove every piece of jewelry that marked her as a Briarwood wife. The silver Luna bracelet first, the metal cool against her fingers, then the hairpin shaped like a crescent moon, a gift from their wedding day. Then the moonstone ring he had placed on her finger the day they married, the one he had said would never leave her hand. One by one, she set them down on the table, the soft sounds of metal against wood, the only noise in the otherwise silent room. Ellis rose quickly, alarm finally breaking through his composure. Clara, wait. The woman who protected your pride is gone, she said, and there was no anger left in her voice now, only a quiet finality that frightened him more than shouting ever could have. She left the chamber before dawn, moving quietly through halls she had once hoped would feel like home, past portraits of Briarwood ancestors who had never once looked at her with anything resembling warmth. Outside the palace gates, beneath a sky still dark with the last hours of night, Rowan Carlyle was waiting, his horse saddled, his expression calm, in a way that told her he had been expecting this moment for longer than she realized. He asked her nothing. He simply stepped forward, removed his own cloak, and settled it over her shoulders against the cold morning air. "Your mother never stopped keeping the northern road open for you," he said quietly, his voice gentle, carrying none of the judgment she had braced herself for. Clara looked toward the path that led away from Briarwood, and toward the place she had once called home, the mountains barely visible against the dark horizon. She understood, standing there in the cold morning air with Rowan's cloak around her shoulders, that her bloodline had never abandoned her. Not for a single day she had been gone. She had been the one to walk away from herself, piece by piece, season by season, for the sake of a man who had never once protected her the way she had spent years protecting him. Rowan helped her onto the second horse without a word, adjusting the stirrups for her, the way he had done countless times when they were children, racing along the Remington cliffs, long before either of them understood what loyalty would eventually cost. They rode in silence for the first hour, the sound of hooves against frozen ground, the only thing breaking the quiet of the early morning. It was Clara who finally spoke. "You knew this day would come. I hoped it would not have to," Rowan said, his eyes on the road ahead. "But I knew the kind of man Ellis was capable of being, even if you did not want to see it for a long time. I never said anything, because it was not my place, and because I did not want you to think my concern came from anything other than wanting you safe." "And now?" Clara asked. "Now," Rowan said, "I only want you to rest, and to remember who you were before any of this began." She did not answer, but she let the words settle over her as the keep slowly came into view ahead of them, rising pale and steady against the morning sky. Remington Keep rose from the snowy cliffs, like something carved from the mountain itself, silver wolf banners snapping in the wind above its highest towers, visible from miles away against the pale winter sky. Clara had not seen those banners in years, and the sight of them now, rising slowly into view as Rowan's horse climbed the final stretch of road, brought a tightness to her throat she had not expected to feel after everything else that had happened. The gates opened before she even spoke her name. The guards recognized her instantly, despite the years, despite the simple gray traveling clothes that bore none of the Remington colors. One of them, an older man who had served her family since before she was born, bowed his head and murmured a welcome that nearly undid the careful composure she had held together through the entire journey north. Lady Rosalind Remington stood at the top of the stone steps, dressed in the deep blue of the Remington colors, her posture as commanding as Clara remembered from childhood, her silver hair pulled back in the same severe style she had always favored. Clara braced herself, climbing the steps slowly, for judgment she felt she had earned. She remembered leaving against her mother's clear warnings, remembered insisting that love mattered more than bloodline, more than legacy, more than anything a throne could ever offer a person. She expected to hear those old warnings repeated back to her now, sharpened by years of being proven right. Instead, Rosalind opened her arms. Clara crossed the remaining distance between them, and allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, to simply be held, without needing to explain herself first. She did not cry loudly. The release that came was quieter than that, the slow exhale of someone who had been holding her breath for years without fully realizing it, the kind of relief that arrives only after the danger has fully passed. "A woman may make mistakes for love," Rosalind said softly, her hand resting gently against Clara's hair, the way it had when Clara was a small child afraid of storms. "But she must never stay somewhere love has quietly turned into humiliation. That is the only mistake I would have stopped you from making, if I could have." Later that day, inside the great hall of Remington Keep, with the fires lit against the mountain cold and the old banners hanging undisturbed above them, Rosalind placed the heir ring on Clara's finger, the same ring that had been worn by every Remington heiress for generations, stretching back further than anyone in the room could fully trace. "The council has been waiting for your return," Rosalind told her, holding Clara's hand a moment longer than necessary. "I never removed your name from the line of succession, not once, in all these years. I always believed you would find your way back, whatever form that return took." Clara looked down at the ring, silver and ancient. the metal worn smooth by generations of hands before her own, and felt something settle inside her chest that had been unsteady for far too long. In the days that followed, the Remington Council met formally to confirm her return, a smaller gathering than the Grand Court Briarwood favored, but no less serious in its purpose. The elders who had known Clara since childhood studied her closely as she answered their questions about her years away, about Briarwood's politics, about the state of relations between the two territories. She answered each question honestly, holding nothing back, and watched as their initial caution slowly gave way to something closer to quiet respect. By the end of the session, the eldest among them, a woman who had served 3 generations of Remington heirs, rose and formally welcomed Clara back into the line of succession before the full gathering, her voice carrying the weight of long tradition. Clara felt, standing there before people who had known her bloodline her entire life, something she had not felt in years at Briarwood, however hard she had tried to find it there. She felt seen, not for what she could offer someone else, but simply for who she already was. Back at Briarwood, news of her departure had not yet softened into the story Evangeline hoped it would become. Ellis assumed in the early days that Clara would return once her anger had cooled, the way she always had before during smaller disagreements. Evangeline insisted to anyone who would listen that Clara had nowhere else to go, no real home beyond Briarwood's walls. Noelle suggested, with a confidence that did not quite reach her eyes whenever the subject arose, that Clara was too attached to Ellis to stay away for long. Then a messenger arrived at the Briarwood gates, carrying a sealed letter bearing the Remington crest, the wax stamp pressed deep and unmistakable. The letter announced, in formal and unmistakable language, that Clara Remington had resumed her position as heiress to the Remington pack, and that all political agreements between Remington and Briarwood would be reviewed under entirely new terms going forward. Among the household staff, news of the letter spread quickly, despite Evangeline's attempts to keep it contained within the family. Servants who had grown quietly fond of Clara during her years at the palace whispered to one another about what it might mean, some hopeful that the rightful order of things was finally being restored, others simply relieved that someone, finally, had found the strength to walk away from a situation everyone in the palace had long recognized as unjust, even if none of them had dared to say so aloud while she still lived among them. One older maid, the same woman who had once brought fresh linens to Clara's chamber every morning without being asked, found herself near tears, reading a copy of the announcement posted later in the servants' hall. She remembered Clara's kindness toward the staff during her years there, small gestures most ladies of her station never bothered with, remembering names, asking after sick children, never once raising her voice, even on the hardest days. She deserved better than this place gave her, the maid murmured to a younger servant standing beside her, and the younger woman, who had only worked at the palace a short while, nodded without fully understanding the weight behind the words. Ellis read the letter twice in the privacy of his study, before the full meaning fully settled over him, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. For the first time since she had left, standing alone in a study that suddenly felt far too large, he understood that Clara had never been as powerless as he had allowed himself to believe. He called for Evangeline immediately, the letter still in his hand, and when she arrived, he held it out without a word. She read it twice, her expression shifting from disbelief to something closer to anger. She would not dare, Evangeline said, though her voice carried less certainty than her words intended. She has already done it, Ellis replied quietly, sitting down heavily behind his desk. It is signed. It is sealed. The council will honor it, whether we wish them to or not. Evangeline paced the length of the study, her mind already turning toward strategy, toward ways the situation might still be salvaged. Then we will simply remind the council of her departure, of how she left her duties behind without warning. We will remind them of the air Noelle carries. Ellis said nothing for a long moment, staring at the fire rather than at his mother. Some part of him, buried beneath months of careful justification, had already begun to suspect that the story they had built was far less solid than they wanted to believe, and that no amount of reminding the council of anything would change what Clara had become the moment she rode through the Remington gates. In the corridor outside his study, Noelle waited, having heard enough of the conversation through the heavy door to understand the shape of what was coming. She placed a hand against her stomach, an old habit by now, and considered, briefly, whether the comfortable place she had carved out for herself within these walls might prove less permanent than she had allowed herself to believe over the past months. She pushed the thought away quickly, reminding herself that she had come too far to entertain doubt now, and walked on toward her chamber with her chin held high, the way Evangeline had taught her to carry herself in front of the staff. The Alpha Council gathered weeks later, in the grand chamber that sat between Remington and Briarwood territory, to discuss the future of relations between the two packs. Ellis arrived dressed in his finest formal coat, his bearing carefully composed, expecting to negotiate directly with Rosalind the way he always had in years past, certain his position still carried the weight it once did. Instead, the council doors opened, and Clara walked in wearing the silver mantle of the Remington Heiress, the fabric catching the light from the high windows as she crossed the floor with measured, unhurried steps. The same nobles who had laughed softly behind their hands the night she left Briarwood now lowered their heads as she passed between the rows of seats. Ellis stood frozen near his place at the table, the color draining slowly from his face. Evangeline's expression hardened into something close to fury, her hands gripping the edge of the table in front of her. Noelle, seated near the back of the chamber where lesser guests were placed, went very still, her earlier confidence visibly faltering. Clara did not raise her voice as she took her seat. She did not need to. The silence of the room did the work for her. Briarwood's treatment of me violated the honor agreement between our two packs, she said, addressing the full council with the same calm steadiness her mother had taught her since childhood. I left with nothing that belonged to Briarwood. Everything I owned before my marriage remains mine, under Remington law, as has always been the case. Evangeline rose, attempting to regain control of a room that had already slipped from her grasp. She abandoned her husband. She left her duties without warning, without explanation to this council. He abandoned me first, Clara replied evenly, her eyes meeting Evangeline's without flinching. The moment he allowed another woman to take my place, while still calling me his wife in front of this very council, and in front of his entire court. A murmur moved through the gathered nobles, different now from the cruel laughter that had followed her out of the throne hall months earlier. This murmur carried something closer to discomfort, the sound of people beginning to reconsider a story they had accepted too quickly. Noelle spoke up from her seat, her voice trembling in a way that had worked well on her before, in smaller rooms with fewer witnesses. She hates me only because I carry the future heir of Briarwood. The truth of that child, Clara said calmly, choosing each word with deliberate care, will reveal itself soon enough, in its own time. The words landed with more weight than Clara had perhaps intended them to carry, and she watched something flicker across Noelle's face, brief but unmistakable to anyone watching closely. A flash of fear quickly smoothed back into composure. Rowan, seated near Clara as her advisor and representative of Remington's interests, stepped forward and presented evidence the council had not yet seen. Witnesses from the eastern border had observed Noelle meeting privately, on more than one occasion, with another Alpha's border guard, in the weeks before she arrived at Briarwood seeking shelter and protection. Noelle denied it immediately, her voice rising for the first time, but the fear visible in her eyes told a far different story than the words leaving her mouth. One of the council elders, a stern woman from a territory bordering both Briarwood and the lands where the meetings had reportedly occurred, asked Noelle directly to name the guard in question and explain the purpose of their meetings. Noelle hesitated, her composure slipping further with each passing second of silence, before claiming the witnesses must have mistaken her for someone else entirely, a claim the council received with visible skepticism. Evangeline attempted to redirect the conversation back toward Clara's departure, but the elders were no longer willing to be steered so easily away from the new questions now hanging over the room. Ellis turned slowly to look at her from across the chamber, something uncertain and cold creeping into his expression for the first time since the proceedings had begun. Clara closed the council session with a final statement, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the chamber. Remington will withdraw all support from Briarwood until this matter is settled fully and honestly before this council, with no further delays. She rose and left the chamber, with the same calm she had entered it, the silver mantle moving softly behind her, leaving behind a room far less certain of itself than it had been only an hour before. Outside the chamber doors, Rowan caught up to her stride, matching her unhurried pace as they walked the long stone corridor back toward the visitors' wing, where Remington's delegation had taken residence for the duration of the council session, the late afternoon light slanting gold across the floor ahead of them. "You did not raise your voice once," he said, something close to admiration in his tone. "I did not need to," Clara replied. "I learned long ago that the people who shout the loudest are usually the ones most afraid of being questioned. I would rather they remember the silence." Behind them, the chamber doors opened again, and Evangeline emerged alone, her composure visibly cracked for the first time since Clara had known her. She did not approach. She simply stood at the top of the steps, watching Clara walk away with an expression that might, on another woman's face, have looked almost like fear. Rowan noticed it too. "She knows it is slipping away from her." "It already has," Clara said. "She simply has not finished saying goodbye to it yet." That evening, back in the visitors' chambers, Rowan brought Clara a small report from one of the territories that had begun, quietly, to reach out to Remington, with renewed interest now that Briarwood's standing had weakened. He set it aside without reading it aloud, watching her instead, as she stood by the window, looking out over the unfamiliar grounds of the council estate. "You are tired," he said simply. "I am," Clara admitted. "I did not expect winning to feel quite this heavy." "It rarely does," Rowan said, "when the cost of losing the other thing was so high to begin with. Victory does not erase what came before it. It only gives you somewhere steadier to stand while you carry it." Clara turned from the window to look at him, grateful, not for the first time, that he had never once asked her to pretend the weight was lighter than it actually was. The truth arrived sooner than anyone at Briarwood expected, faster than even Evangeline's careful planning could prepare for. Noelle went into early labor during a tense stretch of council negotiations, the news spreading through the palace within hours. Evangeline treated the news as something close to celebration, ordering the finest healers brought in, the nursery prepared, the household staff instructed to ready a welcome befitting the future heir of Briarwood. Ellis, anxious but quietly hopeful despite everything that had happened, allowed himself to believe that if the child truly was his, he might still salvage what remained of his standing, might still find some way back to the life he had once taken for granted. Word reached Remington Keep quickly, carried by messengers who moved between the two territories with increasing frequency now that formal negotiations remained unresolved. Clara received the news calmly, standing at the window of her chamber, overlooking the snow-covered courtyard below, without rushing toward Briarwood, the way the old version of herself, the version who had once given up everything for Ellis, might have done without thinking twice. She thought, briefly, of the years she had spent hoping for a child of her own within those palace walls, years spent quietly absorbing the council's disappointment, as though it belonged to her alone. She felt no bitterness now, only a distant kind of clarity, the way one might look back on a fever finally broken, and wonder how it had ever felt so consuming at the time. "Truth does not need to be chased," she told Rowan, who had come to stand beside her at the window, his presence steady and familiar, in a way she had come to rely on more than she fully admitted to herself. "It arrives on its own, in its own time, whether we go looking for it or not." The child was born healthy after a difficult labor, and for a brief moment, the palace allowed itself to believe fully in the story it had built so carefully around the birth. Bells rang from the highest tower. Evangeline wept openly with relief and joy in front of the household staff. Ellis held the infant for the first time with trembling hands, searching the small face for some resemblance to himself. Then the healers examined the infant's blood mark, the small crescent marking every wolf carried from birth that revealed their true pack lineage, visible only to those trained to read it. The mark did not belong to the Briarwood line. The hall fell into stunned, complete silence. Evangeline refused at first to accept what stood plainly before her, demanding the healers examine the child again, certain some mistake had been made in their reading of it. The senior healer, an elderly man who had served 3 generations of Briarwood births, repeated his examination twice more, under Evangeline's insistence, each time arriving at the same conclusion, his voice growing quieter and more careful with each repetition, aware of the weight his words now carried in the room. Ellis demanded explanations no one in the room could give him, his voice rising in a way that frightened the household staff gathered near the doorway. He paced the length of the nursery, running a hand through his hair, looking at the infant, and then away again, as though the small face might somehow rearrange itself into something more familiar if he simply looked hard enough. Under the crushing weight of the moment, Noelle finally broke, admitting through tears that she had never been entirely certain whose child she carried, only that securing a permanent place within Briarwood had mattered more to her, in the end, than the truth of it ever had. She named, between sobs, the guard the council had questioned weeks earlier, confirming what Rowan's evidence had already strongly suggested. The humiliation that fell over Ellis in that moment mirrored, almost exactly, the humiliation Clara had once carried alone in front of the entire court, in this very palace, surrounded by people who had laughed instead of helping her. Evangeline's dream of a grandson to secure the bloodline collapsed in front of the same nobles who had once cheered the announcement of Noelle's pregnancy with such certainty. Evangeline sat down slowly in a nearby chair, her hands trembling in a way none of the staff had ever witnessed from her before. The careful authority she had carried for decades, draining visibly from her posture. She did not speak for a long while, staring at the infant the healers still held, the grandson she had already begun, in her mind, to name and claim, now revealed to belong to no one in this room at all. Noelle was escorted from the palace within days, her belongings packed quickly and quietly by staff, who no longer looked at her with the deference they had offered only weeks before. She left without ceremony, the same way she had once arrived, claiming to need nothing more than shelter and safety. Slowly, over the following days, the full council began to understand the complete shape of what had actually happened at Briarwood over the past months. They understood now why Clara had remained silent for so long during her marriage, and they understood, with growing discomfort, the full depth of what Ellis had allowed to happen to her in exchange for a promise that had never once been real. Ellis sent a desperate message to Remington Keep, insisting through the messenger that he had been deceived as much as anyone in this entire affair, that the situation had spiraled far beyond anything he had ever intended when it began. Clara read the message once, standing alone near the fireplace in her private study. Then, she walked the short distance to the flames and placed it carefully into the fire, watching the paper curl and darken at the edges until nothing remained but soft gray ash. "A man who chooses betrayal cannot call himself deceived," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room, when that same betrayal eventually turns against him. Rowan, who had been standing near the doorway, watched her carefully as the last of the ashes settled in the grate. "You feel nothing for him, even now, after everything that happened tonight?" Clara considered the question honestly before answering, turning it over the way she had learned to turn over every difficult thing in her life since leaving Briarwood. "I feel something. I am not certain it is anything close to what I once felt. Perhaps it is only the memory of feeling something, worn thin enough to see through." "That sounds like grief," Rowan said gently. "Perhaps it is," Clara admitted, "but grief for what I believed we were, not for what we actually became. There is a difference, even if it does not always feel like one in the moment." Word of the collapsed claim spread quickly through the northern territories in the days that followed, carried by messengers and traveling merchants alike, each version of the story growing slightly more dramatic than the last. By the time it reached the furthest borders of Remington's allies, Briarwood's name had become, for the first time in generations, a cautionary tale rather than a symbol of strength. Ellis arrived at Remington Keep weeks later, traveling alone through a steady rain that soaked through his coat long before he reached the outer gates, his horse exhausted from the long journey north. He no longer carried himself like a proud alpha king, accustomed to deference and respect. He looked tired, smaller somehow than Clara remembered him being, a man who had finally run out of explanations to offer anyone, including himself. The guards at the gate recognized him immediately and sent word ahead before allowing him through, none of them quite certain whether to treat him as an honored guest or simply as a man who had once caused their lady considerable harm. He waited in the rain a long moment before they finally opened the gates, water running from the brim of his coat, and Clara, watching from a high window, felt none of the satisfaction she might once have imagined feeling at the sight of him standing small and soaked at her family's gates. He asked the gate guards to speak with Clara alone, and word was carried up to the keep, where Clara sat near the fire with Rowan, going over reports from the eastern border that had nothing to do with Briarwood at all. Rowan offered to remain nearby, his expression unreadable, but his loyalty plain in the offer itself. Clara shook her head gently, setting the reports aside. "I can face him myself. I have nothing left to fear from this conversation." She met Ellis in the small receiving room near the front of the keep, rain striking the tall windows in a steady, unbroken rhythm. He stood when she entered, water still dripping from his coat onto the stone floor, his hands restless at his sides. He apologized first, his voice rough with something that sounded, to her surprise, close to genuine regret rather than performance. He said Noelle had lied to him from the very beginning of their arrangement. He said his mother's pressure had been relentless, wearing him down over months, until he could no longer see clearly what he was agreeing to. He said fear of losing the pack entirely, of failing the legacy he had been raised to protect, had clouded every decision he made during those months. He said, once more, quietly, that he had always loved her, that nothing about that had ever been false. Clara listened without interrupting, letting him finish everything he had traveled this far through the cold and rain to say, giving him the space she had once given him so freely during their marriage, though for very different reasons now. When he was finally done, the room quiet except for the rain against the glass, she spoke calmly. The greatest betrayal was never Noelle. It was never even the child, or the lie about the child. It was every single moment you allowed me to stand alone in front of people who mocked me, while you protected your own comfort instead of standing beside me. "I am asking for another chance," Ellis said, taking a half step toward her. "I know I do not deserve one. I am asking anyway. Love is not watching another woman wear your wife's place like something she found and simply decided to keep," Clara said, her voice steady, carrying none of the anger that had once burned beneath her composure during their final months together. "Love does not ask one person to carry shame quietly, so the other can sit safely on a throne, untouched by any of it." Ellis opened his mouth to argue, some old instinct rising in him to defend himself one more time, then closed it again, a slow understanding settling visibly over his features as he looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in years. "I once left my bloodline for love," Clara told him, her voice gentle now rather than sharp, the gentleness of someone speaking a simple, settled truth. "I will not leave myself again, not for you, not for anyone, ever again." Ellis lingered a moment longer, as though some part of him still expected the conversation to end differently, the way conversations between them once had, with her softening eventually, with her finding some way to forgive what could not easily be forgiven. When she said nothing further, he finally nodded, accepting at last what the silence between them confirmed. "I am sorry," he said quietly, the words simple and unembellished for the first time all evening. "Not because I lost you. I am sorry for the years I let you believe you were the one who had failed, when the failure was always mine to own." Clara studied him for a long moment, searching for any trace of the performance she had grown so used to expecting from him, and found, to her quiet surprise, that there was none. "Thank you for saying that," she said finally. "It does not change what happened, but I am glad you finally see it clearly." He left Remington Keep that evening with nothing more to say, the rain swallowing the sound of his horse's retreat, long before he passed through the outer gates and disappeared down the mountain road, back toward a palace that no longer felt, to him, like the home it once had. Later that night, Clara stood alone on the balcony of the keep, watching moonlight settle slowly over the snow-covered cliffs below, the storm having finally passed, leaving the sky clear and bright with stars. Rowan found her there, quiet as always in the way he moved through the world, and stood beside her without speaking for a long, comfortable moment. The silence between them, easy in a way, silence with Ellis had never quite managed to be. "I am proud of you," he finally said, his voice low, the words simple and unhurried. Clara turned to look at him, the moonlight catching the edges of her face. "Why did you wait so long to say things like that to me?" "Because love should never become another cage," Rowan answered simply, holding her gaze without looking away. "I have cared for you quietly for a long time, longer than either of us probably realized at the time. But I never wanted you to feel pressured into choosing me, the way you once felt pressured into protecting Ellis, into carrying weight that was never truly yours to carry. I only want to stand beside you, as a friend, a protector, an equal, for however long you need that from me, and for nothing more than that unless you ever choose it for yourself." Something in Clara's chest, worn down by years of carrying weight that was never hers to carry, finally eased in a way she had not expected, a quiet loosening she felt in her shoulders, and in the careful way she had been holding herself for longer than she realized. "I am not ready to belong to anyone," she told him honestly, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "But I am ready to live again, fully, without apologizing for the space I take up in my own life." "That is enough," Rowan said. "It is more than enough, in fact. I am not interested in being chosen out of need, or out of loneliness, or because you feel you owe someone your time after everything you have survived. When you choose, if you ever choose, I want it to come from somewhere steadier than that." Clara studied him in the moonlight, struck again, as she often was lately, by how little he asked of her, compared to what she had grown used to giving away so freely in her years at Briarwood. "You make it sound simple." "It is simple," Rowan said. "People only make it complicated when they want something they are not willing to wait for. I have learned to be patient. I find I do not mind the waiting, as long as it is you on the other side of it." Rowan smiled, and it was enough, for now, for both of them, standing together on the balcony beneath the clear winter sky. In the weeks that followed, Clara stood before the full Remington pack, as their rightful heiress, silver wolf banners rising behind her in the cold mountain wind, the same banners that had welcomed her home the night she returned. The council gathered below the steps, nobles from territories near and far, come to witness the formal recognition of her place at the head of one of the oldest bloodlines in the Northern Kingdom. She had lost a love built on silence and sacrifice, a love that had asked her to disappear a little more each year, in exchange for promises that grew thinner with time. But she had gained something far more lasting in its place: herself, fully and completely, her bloodline restored and respected, and a future no longer shaped by anyone else's pride or fear. She had once left her alpha bloodline for love. She returned to it with a heart far stronger than any crown, and a quiet certainty that whatever came next, she would meet it standing fully in her own name. In the months that followed, life at Remington Keep settled into a rhythm Clara had nearly forgotten she was capable of enjoying. She rose early most mornings, walking the same cliffside paths she had walked as a girl, watching the sun climb slowly over the eastern mountains, while the rest of the keep still slept. The cold air sharp and clean against her face, in a way that felt, more and more, like coming back to herself one quiet morning at a time. The council came to her with matters large and small, and she found, to her quiet surprise, that the work suited her in a way her years at Briarwood never had. There was a clarity to leading a pack honestly, without secrets folded beneath every decision, that she had not realized she was missing until she finally had it back, fully and without condition. Word reached her occasionally from Briarwood, carried by traders and travelers passing through Remington territory. Evangeline's influence over the council there had weakened considerably in the wake of the scandal, the older nobles less willing to defer to her judgment than they once had been. Ellis remained on the throne, but reports described a quieter court now. Fewer feasts, fewer grand announcements, a palace learning to govern itself without the certainty it had once taken for granted. Clara did not seek out this news. She did not avoid it either. It simply arrived, the way weather arrives. Something to be noted, and then set aside in favor of the work in front of her. There were nights, even still, when she found herself thinking of the early years with Ellis, the easy laughter, the quiet mornings, before the weight of the crown had settled fully between them. She did not push these memories away when they came. She had learned that pretending a thing had never mattered was its own kind of dishonesty, one she no longer had patience for. She let the memories pass through her instead, acknowledged, examined, and finally released, like clouds moving across the mountain peaks outside her window, present for a while and then simply gone, leaving the sky clearer than before. Rowan remained close, exactly as he had promised that night on the balcony, never pressing for more than she was ready to offer. They spent long evenings reviewing border reports together, and longer ones simply talking, about small things mostly. The kind of conversations Clara realized she had not allowed herself in years. She found herself laughing more easily than she remembered being able to, the sound surprising her each time it happened. One evening, nearly a year after her return, Rosalind found her daughter standing at the same window where she had once watched Ellis's messenger ride away in defeat. The view had not changed, but something in the way Clara held herself had. "You look settled," Rosalind observed, coming to stand beside her. "I feel settled," Clara said, "for the first time in longer than I can remember." "And Rowan?" Clara smiled, though she did not look away from the window. "Patient, steady. He has never once asked me to be anything other than exactly what I am." "That is rarer than people think," Rosalind said. "I am beginning to understand that," Clara replied. She thought, in that quiet moment beside her mother, of the bracelet she had once let fall to the marble floor of Briarwood's throne hall, the small silver circle she had never once gone back for. She did not need it returned to her. She had come to understand, in the months since, that some things were better left exactly where they fell, markers of a life she had outgrown, rather than losses worth mourning. What she carried instead now was lighter, steadier, entirely her own. Rosalind was quiet for a moment, watching her daughter's face in the fading light. "Your father once told me something similar, many years ago, before either of us understood what kind of leaders we would become. He said the strongest partnerships are built by two people who could each survive perfectly well alone, but choose, instead, to stand together." I did not understand him fully at the time. I think I do now, watching you. Clara turned from the window at last, meeting her mother's eyes. "I am not sure I am ready to call it a partnership yet, but I no longer feel afraid of what it might become, if I let it." "That fear leaving you," Rosalind said, "is worth more than any crown you will ever wear. Do not rush past noticing it." Below them, the silver wolf banners of Remington moved gently in the evening wind, the same banners that had welcomed her home, the same ones that would, she now believed, watch over whatever she chose to build next, on her own terms, in her own time, answering to no one but herself. She had once left an alpha bloodline for love, believing love alone could be enough to build a life upon. She had learned, in the years since, that love without respect was only another kind of cage, however gently it was offered. What she had found instead, in the quiet strength of her own bloodline, and in the patient loyalty of someone who asked for nothing she was unwilling to give, was something steadier than any promise whispered across a feast hall. She had returned to her bloodline, a heroine wronged by a man too weak to defend her. She remained there, season after season, simply as herself, finally whole. The snow fell heavier that winter than it had in years, blanketing the cliffs and the keep alike in soft white quiet. And Clara found, watching it from her favorite window each morning, that she no longer measured her days by what she had lost at Briarwood, but by what she was steadily building in its place. There was no grand ceremony marking the change, no single moment she could point to and say, this was when she became whole again. It happened slowly instead, the way most true healing does, in mornings spent walking familiar cliffside paths, in evenings spent laughing over small things with people who had never once asked her to make herself smaller for their comfort, in the quiet certainty that the silver wolf banners above her would always mean home, exactly as they had before she ever left, and exactly as they would for as long as she chose to stand beneath them.